Welcome, welcome, everyone. Ethan, what are we smoking tonight?
Well, tonight, the pipe that I have is a special corncob pipe from the Missouri Meerschaum Company in Washington, Missouri. They have been making corncob pipes since 1869, and they brought, basically, the company built that town. It's a very nice little town. I was there not too long ago. I bought this pipe and one other, and this tobacco. Given that the 4th of July is coming up, I thought it would be appropriate to be smoking American Patriot.
I believe that is appropriate, yes.
And like all good American patriots, this tobacco is an English tobacco with hints of whiskey.
Mm.
Just like the United States is England with hints of, well, more than hints of whiskey.
Yes, many more hints.
Much more than
hints.
several hints of whiskey.
We started English and then we had fun.
We started speaking English and then we drank so much nobody could tell what language we were speaking anymore.
Yep. We were English, but we just kept winning wars after they didn't. That is a nice color of a pipe, gotta say. Similar to my own, which is back there somewhere, but like reversed colors on the portions. Like my stem is white and the bowl is a darker reddish brown, and yours is a reversed, and it's a corn cob. So, how do you dye a corn cob pipe?
So I don't think this is a dye. I think this is a finish of some kind, a sealing finish of some kind that they do.
Just on the outside, speaking as someone who is not an expert, I find it hard to see how you would stain and finish a corn cob pipe.
Well, if you take all the husks off or all the kernels off of a corn cob, what you're left with, you can dry and work and turn basically as though it were a piece of wood.
That then makes more sense, yeah. And it also makes sense why they would be basic and yet so popular. I don't mean basic in a bad way. Just like it's Jim Beam white label, but with more class. Like there's something special to, like, if your grandfather had Jim Beam white label and your father had Jim Beam white label, maybe you really love whiskey. Maybe there's like 1,000 ones that you think the taste is like objectively better on some scale in your head or whatever, but it doesn't match the treasure that is Jim Beam white label, because that's what your dad and granddad drink.
That's what the corncob pipe is for basically all of the United States. There's nothing more American than a corncob pipe.
And that makes it of the highest class. Or at least as high a class as America can be. We do have our own definition of class. What's the drink?
Same as it was last week. My Pinckney Bend Distillery cask-finished gin.
All right. And I don't believe we discussed this, but what's the proof on that thing?
I'd have to check the bottle. I think it's 80.
Solid. I can't say I know what like the normal range is for gin. Whiskey is my realm. Not gin or rum or anything else, but do you know anything about that?
I don't have a lengthy experience with gin, but as far as I know, typical proofing is between 70 and 90.
Okay. Right in the sweet spot then. I have Four Roses Small Batch, which is on the proof conversation 94. And I should actually understand more like how their recipes work, because they have like 4 different recipes, and the different things that they make are just combinations of those recipes. Or not recipes, but mash bills. So I could sit here and have studied and say I know what I'm doing, but of course I don't. And that's okay. I enjoy it, and it makes for a great old-fashioned too.
Bourbon is a wonderful thing, just as American as the corncob pipe.
Yes, it is. Well,
and gin is the drink of sailors, as I sit here honoring Popeye the Sailor Man.
Not rum? You would think
the British Empire was built on the gin and tonic.
Fair enough. It does call back to, though, that we are English with improvements. So
We're the English after a few drinks.
Yes. That explains a lot of American culture, I think.
It does, doesn't it?
English with a lot of drinks. English with a lot of drinks. Well, we wanted to talk about education tonight. And we'd like to take the same approach to it kind of as we did work last week. So we sit here 5 years removed from COVID during a tumultuous upheaval of a lot of things in the world, not just work and not just education, but valid ways to start. And not that this is a what did we learn from COVID podcast. That's not the purpose of this.
No, but it just so happens to be that when we're starting this podcast, it's 5 years since COVID, and 5 is an arbitrarily good number for years since last chaotic event.
It is our place in history. And it behooves us to think about that. So, last week we wove through the history of work. Where was humanity for a long time? How did it change throughout the ages? And what lessons can we glean from that? What do we think makes good work? What do we think doesn't make good work? And we can take the same approach with education. So, how things change through the ages, what lessons can we glean from that? And what methods of education do we think are the best in our time in history now? So, at this point, I once again defer to the resident history major, Mr. Ethan. Where do you want to start with this?
Might as well start with the ancient days.
How far
for a long
are
time,
we going?
Let's go back to Aristotle because he's the first guy that kind of knew everything.
Works.
Well, maybe a little bit farther back to Socrates, but the system, in quotes, is basically still the same. So, in the ancient days, you were brought to a teacher, and you had a specific teacher and a tutor. And that's probably if you were pretty much only of a noble class. So like Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle. That's a very well-known fact of history. That's because he happened to be the son of the Emperor of Macedonia, who could afford to pay the smartest man in the entire known world to tutor his son for him. But, so, in the Greek tradition, which sort of winds up getting melded with the Jewish tradition later on around our Lord's time, there's this sort of, you want to learn from this specific teacher or you belong to this specific school of thought. Now, everybody likes to talk about the great Greek thinkers and the great, the Greek philosophers, but at the time, philosophy was just considered, you just think about things and you talk about how things work. So, for example, Aristotle's Politics and Nicomachean Ethics are his two most popular works. They're his two most popular books, which he didn't actually write, but were compiled around the time of his death, or after his death, by his students. But he also had works on physics, on aesthetics. Basically, the idea of philosophy was that we just study what's around us. So, education, back then, was just, we go and we learn from the philosophers. And you just belong to whatever school of philosophers. You got the Epicureans over there, and you've got, Diogenes sitting naked in a barrel over there, founding the Stoics. He's just he's the most fun to talk about. And then you've got Aristotle.
One character, doesn't there?
Yeah. And then you've got the Pythagoreans, who were actually not just mathematicians, but they were also philosophers. They thought about things like, like the nature of the world and like eschatology and all that sort of thing. So,
if I can interject real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, you said that they studied what was around them, and that meant studying the philosophers. Was it just the philosophers, or was it also other different parts of society, whether that be business or politics or farming and agriculture? Like, what did education mean to them in that sense?
Well, if you were a farmer, you taught your son how to farm. If you were a blacksmith, you taught your son blacksmithing. Basically, if you're a father, you teach your son whatever it is you do.
So with those pursuing education in the sense that we're talking about it, did they strictly focus on philosophy? Were they siloed in with their teachers? Or did they kind of take a more liberal arts approach to everything?
So that was more those that were either, one, descended from nobility, two, had connections to the world of the philosophers, or three, showed a particular intuition or particular kind of sense of being able to think about the world in the same way as the philosophers did. So we didn't really have, people laying in bed going, hey, I want to be a philosopher when I grow up. It's more as you develop, you sort of learn what is good about you. And you may be learning to farm. You may also know a trade, because philosophy isn't just going to put food on the table. Socrates had a trade. He was an artisan of some kind. I'm sure somebody in the comments will let me know what exactly it was. I've forgotten it at this point.
Okay.
And it would be rather impolite of me to look it up in the middle of filming. So,
well, you could if you wish. But so it was somewhere in between. Like, you weren't learning everything, obviously, but philosophy did seem to be above everything else.
It's considered high because of the nature of what it is that you're thinking about. Who are we as a race? What is our purpose? What is the point of humanity on Earth? And what might that be in relationship to whatever deity our particular society believes in? And the Jewish tradition is kind of similar to that, although the Jews are a lot better organized, so it's not just, hey, I'm going to go and find this particular philosopher that I like. I'm going to get taken to the temple, and when I'm at the temple, then the priests are going to educate me there. So the education is all done by the priests, and the scribes and the Pharisees, and all those people. Like St. Paul was a Pharisee.
Mm-hmm.
He was educated in the Pharisaical tradition and educated by scribes. Again, I forget the name of his particular teacher, but he was very well-known teacher in the Jewish and Greek traditions. So if we fast forward a little bit farther, by the way, this is also the kind of tradition that St. Augustine would have been taught. Although he learned, it starts to get a little bit more separated at that point. It was already kind of separated, and we had this in the old Greek traditions, but in the Roman tradition that St. Augustine was taught in, so he is taught philosophy, and he's also taught rhetoric at one point. But rhetoric being an orator is a trade, so that is something that you start kind of as an apprentice, and you learn from somebody in particular. So
Okay.
he's taught basically philosophy, he's taught logic, he's taught rhetoric, and he would have understood some of the sciences, because that was just how philosophy was done back then. It was like, we just learn everything that there is to learn about, as far as how the world works and how everything is. And then later on, we all know St. Augustine became probably one of the most brilliant theologians that the church has ever seen. That's a reason he's a doctor of the church. After a while, there's, at the height of the Roman Empire, and then there's the barbarians invade, and that's just after St. Augustine's time. And then everything kind of becomes a mess. And at this point, if you wanted your son to learn something, you would have sent him to the monks, because, you've decided to give yourself to God, and you've locked yourself in a cave for your entire life, but you do need something to do. So a lot of the monks become they're philosophers, they're doctors, they're scientists, they're all sorts of things.
Okay.
But they have a high intellectual tradition and practice, particularly with the Benedictines and the Augustinians, the two earliest orders that we currently have. So at that point, when those orders get spread out and other orders are founded, sort of in what are actually the Dark Ages, which is between the fall of the Roman Empire and the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, that's basically how you are educated. Otherwise, the rest of we're too busy trying to survive and not be killed by Huns and Vandals and Mongols and whoever else happens to be invading. To focus on something like education is important, but survival is more important. So then Charlemagne comes along and establishes the Holy Roman Empire. And over the course of the time of the Holy Roman Empire, because he starts to bring back older education models, and there's sort of there's an explosion, sort of a renaissance before the Renaissance during the time of the Holy Roman Empire. There's this sort of explosion of education. And Christmas Day of the year 800, when Charlemagne is crowned king, crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Saint Leo the Great, is the most widely accepted date for the start of the Middle Ages, of the medieval period.
Okay.
Some people say that, well, the really early medieval period is when Constantine became emperor.
That seems really far back.
It's when a lot of that is tied with Christianity. So the medieval era is intrinsically tied with the spread of Christianity and the practice of Christianity all throughout Europe.
Okay.
So people say that's like pre-medieval, from Constantine up until Charlemagne, but it's also like almost a 500-year era. So at that point,
when Charlemagne is bringing back education models from the past, which ones is he bringing back? Is he going more teacher-centric, philosophy-centric?
So Charlemagne really likes the way that the Romans did a lot of things, at least practically speaking. So he brings a lot of those things back, and it was a height of intellectual prowess and intellectual ability in the time of the Romans.
Okay.
He really likes a lot of their architecture, so he starts bringing some of that back too. But ultimately, what is born, and it's sort of slowly developing throughout the Middle Ages, but ultimately what is born is the what's known as the trivium and the quadrivium. Okay? So the trivium is sort of where you start when you first start in education, and this actually isn't until around what we today would consider late middle school to early junior high.
So you start that late?
With higher education, this is what's considered higher education. Your first level is with the trivium. And, when the church is running education at this time, everybody has to learn catechism first. And the trivium and the quadrivium and the trivium influences that as well. But it's most effective when it's introduced a little bit later, because the trivium is 3 sections. There's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So logic and rhetoric, the 2 things that St. Augustine was first taught, or at least what he developed into.
So thinking and how to articulate said thinking was highest in their minds.
So, and then once you get through the trivium, then there's the quadrivium, and the trivium doesn't go away, but the quadrivium just sort of gets added into it. And the quadrivium, meaning 4 subjects, is geometry, astronomy, music, and arithmetic. Arithmetic being all forms of mathematics and all forms of mathematical science. So, with the exception of geometry, because the study of shapes and space was considered separate from mathematics, which is more of a logical practice as opposed to a practical practice.
And within that, there seems to be an orientation towards, first we're going to teach you to think and how to think, and then next we're going to teach you what to think about. And that stuff that we're going to teach you to think about is, you could say, it is what is good and true and beautiful. It's the basics of how to look at the world, what the world is made of, and the mind behind it, right?
Yes. And this is the model that Thomas Aquinas was brought up in. And he actually helped to further it and develop it into even more of a concrete thing. But that's basically how Thomas Aquinas was educated.
Okay.
So once you get through the trivium and the quadrivium, then you also are basically, you're set up for the university, which is another foundation of our wonderful and great Catholic Church. The university system, the University of Paris, I believe, is the oldest one. The Paris or Boulogne.
Okay.
Basically, that is to then take education a step further, where you can really be specialized. And this is for the people that are really particular and really special, because education as a whole was kind of for everybody and more primarily for the wealthier and more noble classes.
Okay.
So the trivium and the quadrivium are sort of the Thomas Aquinas method. And that actually lasts in education basically until the Enlightenment, or not too far after that.
Okay. This same basic collection of subjects, the framework for how we look at the world. And it stays consistent for that long.
So after the Enlightenment... No, go ahead.
How does it differ, if at all, like between different countries in Europe back then? Like, did the Germans do it differently than the French? Do it differently than the Spanish?
Well, they spoke different languages.
Yes.
But not a whole lot different. It does start to split after the Protestant Reformation. The Germans kind of start wanting to do their own thing, and the Dutch and the Swedish, and then the English have sort of their own way. But okay, it's more minor variations that occur.
Still stays pretty consistent. All right.
But during the Enlightenment, we have this explosion of the sciences. And at that point, even though all of our Enlightenment thinkers, our pre-Enlightenment thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo, and our early Enlightenment thinkers like Isaac Newton and all the rest of them, they are all sort of trained in this classical style, but ultimately what winds up happening is there becomes a shift in how university education is approached, and more subjects wind up getting offered, because ultimately, originally, the approach to physics was, and other sciences, that was sort of all lumped under natural philosophy, which is one of the natural philosophies, which was in the university level of education.
Okay.
And that you had natural philosophy, moral philosophy, and metaphysics. So even though a lot of our Enlightenment thinkers were trained in that, there is sort of this shift into specialized education. And as the Enlightenment progresses on, there becomes a greater focus on science.
Okay.
And there are a lot of brilliant scientists at this time. Most of them are Italian and most of them are Catholic, but the world likes to forget about that.
It's true. If you go back through the ages of history, like, who came up with this? A Catholic. Who came up with this? A Catholic priest.
And at least 3 of them were women. Catholic Italian women, one of whom had 12 children. So, but again, the world doesn't want to acknowledge that Catholic Italians have actually contributed a great deal to education and thinking. So they wind up coming up with this whole narrative that women were never allowed to think for themselves until 50 years ago.
Well,
but that's another topic for another time.
It's a grand shame.
It's a good tobacco. It's fairly mild, which most English tobaccos are.
I should get into tobacco more, or in the pipe smoking sense, but you know me. I
own exactly 4 different tobaccos. So,
well,
I'm not really that far into it at the moment.
Again, you actually smoke them. I don't, because I prefer the convenience of a cigar. And good for you are going through all this trouble to continue to light your pipe. I need to get used to doing that.
Meanwhile, I prefer the elegance and reliability and class of a pipe.
This cannot be argued with. There's a reason that you can align cigarettes with the appetitive part of the soul, cigars with the honor part of the soul, and pipes with the highest part of the soul.
The contemplative part.
Yes.
So basically, because I smoke a pipe, I'm better than you. That's what you're saying.
I cannot argue. So. I have nothing to say.
Back to education.
Yes.
So after the Enlightenment, when the different fields start to get specialized, you've got the anatomists who are specializing in their things, and then you have the physicists who are specializing in their things, and you have surgeons who are specializing in their own things. Eventually comes the Industrial Revolution, and there is an almost immediate change after the Industrial Revolution to how education is approached.
Okay.
So the trivium and the quadrivium are kind of slowly being phased out because we have a lot of like politicians and people of the 19th century were educated in a kind of trivium and quadrivium. Sort of. Particularly in the American South. But the modern concept of the school comes about partially during the American West, when, you have towns that are all together. They've got children of all different ages, and they all have to learn somehow. So the town hires out a teacher who comes in and has been to a teaching college, who is specialized in learning how to teach. And basically gets all these children together, and they kind of all learn at the same time in the same place, but they're all learning at different levels because it's the one-room schoolhouse.
Why does it happen there? Why does it have to happen there? Like, I imagine that if it's purely because, the parents don't have time, well, they probably didn't have time when they were out east.
Oh, they had time when they were out east. Because this is also in the early days of... We'll put it this way. The East had already been civilized and tamed. The kids had to go to a brick-and-mortar school because their parents were busy taming the West. Your dad has to work 12 hours a day from sunup to sundown, basically only gets to take a break on Sunday. And mom is just as busy doing just as many things.
So the time point is valid, okay. Makes sense, yeah.
The homestead way, sort of, and the early township way, because everybody's also busy trying to build a town. And they're having to get these towns up quick. The towns in the West were built way faster than the towns in the East were. Because you're trying to take a town that is brand new and in as short a time as possible, build it up into something that can match what's out in the East.
Because that's what they knew and that's what they admired.
Yes, exactly. That's what they wanted to repeat. Which, when we have our discussion about the American cities, they actually didn't repeat that, because Eastern cities and Western cities have vastly different cultures as a whole. But, again, a topic for a later discussion. Yes. So, at this point in the history of education, it isn't intentionally this way, but it does sort of wind up being about doing it in the most efficient way, which is how industrialism has wound up doing everything. So kind of at the same time in England and in other places in Europe, and even back east in the United States, there's boys' schools and girls' schools being established, where the boys and the girls go to learn different things. And again, because of the Industrial Revolution, parents are also not having the time to teach their children. Because so in the West, Your dad is working 12 hours a day, plowing his field, planting his crops, raising cattle, taming horses, that sort of thing. In the East, your dad is busy working 12 hours a day in a factory, and your mom might be working 12 hours a day in a factory too. So again, they don't really have the time to be sitting down and teaching with their children and doing their job as the primary educators of their children. Just a hint to sort of what happen when we get to the opinion portion of this episode. So the boys' schools and the girls' schools are established because in proper Yankee tradition, we've got to have the boys and the girls separate. And there's some of these in the South too. I can't blame everything on the Yankees. But it does wind up being about trying to
You can always blame me on the Yankees.
No, I blame you on the Twins.
Yes. I thought briefly of how many World Series we have, and then I realized St. Louis has more.
There aren't many teams that have more than St. Louis.
The aforementioned Yankees and who else? The Giants. I think the Giants have a lot.
And the Dodgers. The Yankees, the Giants, and the Dodgers, I think. I'm pretty sure they all have more World Series than the Yankees. But sports is for next time. Or then the Cardinals, I mean. I said the Yankees have more World Series than the Yankees. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Like you said, sports is for next time. Hating the Dodgers is forever.
So, more and more post-industrial revolution, education is kind of approached with this, how can we do it in the most efficient way to these groups of people? So then we have girls' education and we have boys' education. And, this is all how that's done. And then once that kind of starts to go away in the broader aspect, then we just have education as a whole, and we've got co-ed classes kind of everywhere. It hangs on a little bit when you've got, men's colleges and then specifically women's colleges. But ultimately, it winds up becoming about getting as many students educated as possible in a short amount of time using this particular method. Or finding methods that will take a 6-year-old and wind up turning him into an 18-year-old that is educated and ready to be a member of society.
According, I imagine, to some increasingly centralized standards for what it means to be civilized and socialized.
Yes. So as there's a trend towards this type of education, it's very much related. In many ways, it's actually the same kind of thinking that got Henry Ford to create the assembly line. Because when Henry Ford created the assembly line, he was able to churn out way more cars. Economics is all about supply and demand. The more you have of something, the less valuable it is. Therefore, the less somebody has to pay to have it. So Henry Ford is able to take people who were at the time considered poor, and now they can afford cars. Something that was a rich man's thing. It's all about elevating the lower classes to try to bring them up to the same level as the upper class, which, by the way, doesn't work. If everybody is a king, there is no more point in having kings in the first place.
Yep.
The only way to do that is if we have pure democracy, which turns into anarchy in less than a single generation.
It turns into something other than pure democracy and, less, like you said, less than a generation. It's just a matter of what.
You either get anarchy or you get Julius Caesar. And I would rather have Julius Caesar. But, again, political philosophy conversations for a later podcast.
And for a school near you, or not. Depends on the school.
So that ultimately has led to where at least the public school system is now, where it's basically about, we can't have people not going to school, because if you don't go to school in the way that people who are in education say that you need to go to school, you'll just be useless, pretty much. You'll be dumb. And that's sort of, in the latter half of the 20th century, the worst century in human history, you can kind of see this a lot more, because more and more and more you see in like the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, you see parents who are trying to work really, really, really hard so their children can go to school, they can go to college, they can get college degrees, and they can then get a job or they can basically elevate themselves out of being poor or being impoverished or having to work in that same way. But ultimately, it ultimately winds up being this. It winds up just devolving into, well, you can't get any kind of good paying job unless you have a college degree.
Eventually, given enough time.
But then with enough time of that, when you have that for enough time, it winds up being, you know what, your college degree actually is useless.
Yep.
And then you wind up studying really useless things like aromatherapy and pet photography. You want to do those things for a living, fine, but you don't need the college degree. You can learn that some other way.
Well, you've earned this. How was your Ukrainian egg painting class?
That was delightful.
I know.
And the word is pisanki.
Pisanki?
Pisanki. It's not only Ukrainian, but also Polish. And I was taught the Polish method. Thank you very much.
Okay. The Poles are better anyway, so good on them.
In the Ukraine, they do it a little bit more like they do in Russia, where they paint the eggs instead of dyeing them. So what I've just been talking about is actually a very good segue into the question of, well, how do you learn a trade? How do you learn to do something that isn't intellectual? How do you learn to build things? How do you learn to saw and hammer correctly? Well, for a very long time, there was a guild system. That's also a development of the Middle Ages, where the guilds were basically associations of carpenters or blacksmiths or masons, stonemasons, not the creepy kind. So carpenters, blacksmiths, stonemasons, glass cutters who did stained glass. Name a trade. They probably had a guild for it. Cobblers for shoes. Coopers for making barrels, that sort of thing. That learning a trade was approached a lot like the way education was approached in the ancient times, like higher education was approached in the ancient times, is you go to a tradesman and become his apprentice, and you learn his trade.
Mm-hmm.
And he begins teaching you, and he teaches you by having you work alongside him. And as you progress, you go from apprentice to journeyman, and then to master. And those levels were usually determined by the guild. As the association, they get their meetings, they all come together and they say, okay, what does an apprentice have to do to become a journeyman, and what does a journeyman have to do to become a master? And that is basically the approach to every kind of trade, even medicine, for a long time. And today, in most trades, we still have those. We basically still do have that system. It's just in the context of the trade school. Okay. Where you go to that school and then you go to the teacher. It basically takes that and then puts the modern education system on top of it. And it's actually it's a really decent blend. I've met a lot of guys who know their trades incredibly well, who went to the trade school and learned in that particular way.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of that also has to do with who your teacher is.
Yes, but I mean, the model seems to be one worthy of great praise. Beyond just the results-oriented way of looking at it, for the reasons we've been talking about different forms of education in the past, like it makes sense to compare it to some of the older things that are rightly looked up to.
And with other kinds of trades, and they also kind of get lumped into different sects. So you have like the construction trades. That's your your concrete guys, your timber guys, your electricians, your HVAC guys, your plumbers.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all construction trades. You don't necessarily have to go to a trade school to be successful in any of these, but it is helpful. And it's a good way to sort of kickstart it. In basically any of the trades, you can actually do really well starting and ultimately be successful and do it well, which is what matters more than being successful. If you start at the bottom and are just taught by a professional.
Yeah. And this is skipping a little bit ahead into modern times, but I mean, you can learn a lot off of YouTube University, but it doesn't beat. Like I could learn a lot about fixing my car from that, but I could not learn in the same fashion as I could from, humbly, my younger brother, if I just had him teach me, because he knows that stuff really well.
Your brother also basically breathes diesel, or petrol, as the British call it. He's got petrol in his blood, basically.
Well, we are the British.
Considering he's the car guy we're going to have on when we have that discussion.
Yes. He will do quite well.
I think I basically covered the history of education. I've gotten us up to the modern period, so yeah, I've basically covered the history of education.
Solid. Well done, good sir.
Why, thank you. Thank you for listening to my dissertation.
Of course. To go back to that shift, though.
Even if we don't get any views, at least I know you were listening.
To go back to that shift, at the Industrial Revolution to more efficient education models, because we need to do that, and because the parents don't have time. In what ways do the different religions of, let's just take America, differ from the secular model? Like, how do they do the new school system compared to everybody else?
So the interesting thing is that the modern school system was actually first a product of Catholics.
Okay.
The modern Western school system was originally created by Catholics. And the public schools were actually created as a counter to that. Because the Catholics were getting smarter than all of the Protestants, and the Protestants said, well, we can't have that. So why don't we just create public schools where we educate all of our Protestant children together? And then that's where we got the government public school system.
Okay.
Because the Protestants and the government said we can't have the Catholics being smarter than us.
That would be just one example of a lot of anti-Catholic bias that existed in this country. So,
yeah, the public school system. So the public school system, it's not an understatement to say, was created to combat the Catholic faith.
Yeah, and
at least the American public school system.
Okay.
And then that school system winds up being adopted by all of the modern European countries, because there are no true European countries anymore. All of the old nations are dead.
Well, we're still talking like the late 1800s, though.
Even at this point, they're dying. Because remember, this is post-Enlightenment, this is post-French Revolution. And I'm talking more about in like the 20th century, when government schools start being a thing. They look at the American public school model. They either wind up looking at the American public school model, or they'll look at communist Russia. Neither one is great.
So it's been said by enough people that our school system came from like the Prussian model, or at least like that was the origin of the modern school system. So where did that come into play?
That is something that I'm not terribly familiar with, but it would make sense.
Okay.
Prussia being, again, Protestant primarily, which is odd that they had an alliance with Austria during the First World War, that they fought on the same side, because Prussia was Protestant and Austria was Catholic. So the Prussian model, I'm actually not terribly familiar with.
Okay. I don't know everything about it either. My understanding is that when you talk about a school system that by its nature is designed to churn out factory workers, that gets traced back to the Prussian
Makes
model.
sense that it came from the Germans. Yeah.
And that is about all I know. So maybe Maybe that got copied into the U.S.
So the best thing that I can think of is that when the Protestants were going, well, crap, we need to make the Protestant kids as smart as the Catholic kids, we need to do it fast. So they probably then looked at the Prussian model. If Prussia was able to churn out a lot of students and educated people.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a reasonable hypothesis to me. So
that's just my hypothesis. I'm sure I will be proven wrong at some point because, again, that's just me speaking out of my ass.
If he's wrong, let him know in the comments.
But if I was writing that story, that's how I would say it. That's how I do it.
Makes sense. We don't have to be right. We just have to attempt to think.
Precisely. And admit when we're wrong, which is the more important.
Yes.
That's also important for marriage.
Yes.
Another future topic of discussion.
Oh, that's many future topics of discussion loaded into one there.
And I will now posit that we do that before you get married at some point, so we can just basically call it Ethan making Dominic uncomfortable for 2 hours.
Good luck. There's less and less in this world that shocks me anymore, so and not that that's even the right thing to say there.
I will not scandalize you when we talk about marriage.
You're gonna have a fun time trying to really make me uncomfortable. So this history that we've narrated leaves us with a public school system that most people make use of for one reason or another, and that even more people fund, which is another annoying topic of discussion for the future. And yet, it's not the only way that people get their schooling. It's not even, it's one of the major ways, but there's so many different school systems that have popped up, beyond just the major ones of public, private, and homeschool. Obviously, those are the three biggest. But now you have a bunch of little ones popping up all over the place too, so we're both homeschooled. Where does, as far as you know, homeschooling, how does the history of that work? Obviously it dies off a lot because of the advent of these other school systems, but then does it gain a rebirth at a particular point in time? Does it just kind of maintain its status throughout history?
So the current model of homeschooling is pretty young. It's I think a lot of it has to do with one of two things. It's either it's born out of either, well, I don't like the way that the school is teaching my children, so I'm going to do it myself. And usually it's done by mom, because mom's a housewife with a lot of time on her hands and children to raise. Okay. So if I just keep them at home, then I can teach them myself. It's born out of that, and in places where the school is too far away.
Okay.
So I would say homeschooling it probably doesn't get any attention until probably the late 1980s.
Okay. And by
as
attention,
a concept,
do you mean just more people adopting it, or?
Well, more just people becoming aware of it, because more people are probably wound up adopting it.
Okay.
For the late 1980s and into the 1990s, and into the late 90s in particular, is when it kind of starts to hit the ground running. And that's also kind of when, homeschoolers are... There's a stereotype of the homeschooler. When something is stereotyped in media, or even just in common colloquialism, mm-hmm. it's probably fairly... It's reasonably well known to have gained a stereotype.
Okay. The right people just don't like it.
Well, you and I are familiar with what the stereotype of a homeschooler is.
And I'm familiar with not representing it. As are you.
But you and I are also both very familiar with people who were exactly that stereotype.
Yes.
Because we met them in homeschool co-ops. And yeah, I think a lot of it comes
to paint the picture,
from...
by the way, for the outside world, just imagine this as one image. Just imagine that you and a bunch of other of your friends are going to a Lord of the Rings book club. And you have a great discussion, and then mom comes to pick you up, and you're just hoping that the moms chat for forever, because you're now going to fight each other with swords in the yard. Because one of the kids of the mom who was hosting this whole thing has way too many swords for anybody's good, except that statement's a lie, because there's no such thing as too many swords.
Hear, hear.
So, this is the epic nature of a homeschool life.
It's either that, or you're getting, you and the boys are getting together once a month to have a talk on a virtue. But before that, you all put on camo and you go out in the woods and shoot each other with airsoft guns.
Can't say I did that, but that is
also part of the nature of a homeschooled life.
Yes.
And again, there are plenty, because at least two of the guys there have way too many airsoft guns. But again, there's also no such thing as too many guns.
This is also true.
Same logic applies as with swords. So, yeah.
Y'all got to do it, or at least entertain it. But we'll save that for a little bit later into this.
So as far as the birth of homeschooling is, I think it's primarily, it comes about as, so originally the public schools were formed as a counter to the Catholic schools and as Protestant schools, but they were still Christian. So during the latter half of the 20th century, as the public school starts to get more and more atheistic, a lot of the Protestants, a lot of Christians wind up saying, well, we can't send our kids to the Catholic school because we believe all of the rumors about the Catholic schools, and I don't want them to send my kids to the public school, so I'm just going to start teaching my kid at home. So it kind of has homeschooling, modern homeschooling also kind of has Protestant roots, but Catholic families also start doing this as well, because this is also at a time when, again, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, Catholic schools stopped doing their job correctly, and children are coming home not knowing their catechism as well, and then sometimes the children are coming home from school believing actual heresy. And so parents are like, whoa, we can't have that.
Yeah, the spirit of Vatican II and the true spirit of Vatican II were very different things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was my own experience, was there were severe issues, because my brother was 4 years older than me, so he was in fourth grade when I was in kindergarten. And by the time my brother's fourth grade year rolls around, my parents have sort of gotten fed up with the Catholic school that we went to, even though it was just my kindergarten year. So I went to kindergarten in a regular school. My brother went from kindergarten through fourth grade. Then as my parents kind of start learning more stuff, then they're realizing, oh, there's a lot of stuff that we're not liking about how the parochial school is teaching our son. And we don't want our younger son to learn these same things, and then we'll just have to correct him and fix their mistakes when he comes home too. So we're going to go ahead and pull him out. And they looked at the other two, because there's 3 parochial schools in this town. And they looked at the other 2 and they went, well, they're not any better. So they pulled me out of that school. They pulled my brother out, and we started homeschooling immediately the next year.
Fair enough.
So that was just my experience of how homeschooling started. And I was also in one of the, not earliest, but earlier generations of homeschooling, when people were kind of figuring out how to homeschool and how I mean, you're the same age as me, so you're in this generation too. When people are kind of figuring out how to homeschool and how to have groups at the same time, because the reason the stereotype of homeschoolers not being well socialized comes around is because you have kids who never go anywhere until they're 18, and then they just sort of lose it when they leave the house.
Mm-hmm.
Well, homeschoolers then want to stop that stereotype, and that's where co-ops get formed. It's in stopping that stereotype, and then also, well, this gives our kids chances to make friends elsewhere, and we can connect with other homeschoolers and see how they're doing things and what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was brought up in Mother of Divine Grace curriculum, which is an accredited school. It's not a brick and mortar school, but they do have an actual office building in Ojai, California.
Okay. And mine, for the record, was Seton Home Study School, which is also accredited and based out of Virginia.
I don't know that I've ever known that you were a Seton student.
Well, now you do.
You are probably the only Seton student I've ever met that didn't mention being a Seton student every like 5 minutes. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, I guess no. I've only known so many Seton students, so I know 5 or 6 others, and 4 of
My
them are
encounters with a lot of
so.
Seton students are how great Seton is as a program, and then I get bombarded with all of the statistics of how well Seton students do in university.
Well, I don't know the statistics, so I can't say, but I haven't heard a bad thing about Mother of Divine Grace.
I just remember I constantly get bombarded with it. I'm like, chill. I'm Mother of Divine Grace. We're fine too, I guess.
Yes, I have heard nothing negative about, honestly, any homeschool curriculum, now that I think about it.
There are some newer ones coming out that are a little bit fishy because a lot of homeschool curricula are going the way of public schooling. But of the older ones, especially the Catholic ones, particularly Mother Divine Grace, Seton, and Colby, I've never heard anything bad about them. There are things that I could probably say, things that I wish Mother Divine Grace had done better, but that's not me saying anything bad about the program.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that goes for anything. Like, you could always want something better. And there's so many ways to skin the cat of how do you school your kids and on what schedule, and do you do semesters or trimesters or quarters like Seton does? Potato, you know?
Are you the homeschooler who graduated high school at 12 years old because you studied through all of the summers?
Yeah, some of them. And then raised goats on the side.
And raised goats, and your parents don't eat anything that they didn't grow or kill.
That's one hell of a life that we've just described. So, but no, not me. Like, my only real beef.
I don't plan on
Seton,
homesteading.
Yeah,
I like to do a lot of things myself, just because it's a good thing to do, and I would like to start doing a lot of things myself. But again, I live in a neighborhood in a city, and the city and my neighbors, first and foremost, would probably not be too happy if I bought a cow.
That does leave the possibility of just leaving the neighborhood and city.
Yes, but I can't afford property in North Dakota.
Fair enough.
Which means I definitely can't afford property in Minnesota.
Everybody, buy his books. Buy his books, listen to the podcast so he can get out of the hellhole that Jeff City isn't. Because it's not a hellhole.
It's not a hellhole. Jefferson City, Missouri is a wonderful and beautiful town. It's a very old town. Capital city of my state, and at this exact moment I would not rather live anywhere else.
An opinion to be respected.
Okay, now that the mob has left my house and taken their pitchforks and torches with them.
Have they?
Back to education. So,
we've chatted about homeschooling and the other school systems. One that we haven't covered is Montessori. When does that start? Does it start around the same time as homeschooling in the
So,
modern sense?
as I understand it, Montessori education, it's named after Dr. Maria Montessori, who is an Italian teacher and professor and philosopher to an extent. Again, all these Catholic Italian women, they're just doing wonderful things.
Mm-hmm.
She sees kind of how modern education is being approached and winds up thinking that it's kind of being done wrong for early years of education.
Okay.
So she opens a school called Casa dei Bambini, which means the house of the children. Basically, her theory, which as far as I know has been proven in many different circumstances, her theory is that children learn by being children. So you don't really start the formal education until they start maturing into adults, which just so happens to be about 12 or 13 or 14.
Okay.
Now, I think there is a Montessori school down the road for me. I think the last time I looked, they only go through 4th grade. And that's where a lot of Montessori schools stop. But some of them go all the way through 6th grade and some even to 8th grade.
Okay.
Now, as I understand Montessori education, again, this is a brand new thing for me. Our alma mater, the amazing University of Mary, best school in the whole United States, has actually just started the world's first Catholic Montessori education program.
Okay.
So there are a lot of schools that have Montessori education as a major and as a degree, and there are a lot of Catholic Montessori schools. But up until this point, Montessori schools have been trying to take this Montessori model, which Maria Montessori didn't, she just sort of intended it for everybody. And being 20th century, everything is kind of secular at that point. But the Catholic schools that want to do Montessori stuff, 2 very good ones in Mandan, they sort of have to learn the Montessori model of education and then make it Catholic. So as far as I'm aware, what UMary is now doing is creating a Catholic Montessori model of education for early childhood. So basically what I understand is that Montessori education is kind of just letting your child be a child.
Much more about the social education side of it than, okay, we're going to learn.
Well, they don't
learn
put the
geometry
kid.
now.
They don't make the kid sit in a chair for 8 hours a day. They don't make a 6-year-old sit in a chair for 8 hours a day and then write homework assignments out.
That's much more well said than what I said. Yes.
They have other ways. They have basically what are effectively toys, but they're way more than that because the kids are actually learning these things. And so there's the Montessori model, and then there's what modern preschool tries to do. So modern preschool starts with the idea of the modern idea of education, and then says, well, the kids have to learn something, but all they want to do is play. So why don't we try to trick the kids into learning by making it look like they're playing? And what Montessori does is basically say, well, children want to play. They don't want to sit in a classroom and learn. They want to play. So why don't we tailor the learning so that the learning actually is play? And you're teaching your child just practical skills and practical things. It's just teaching your child how to count and how to spell and how to talk. One of her biggest quotes, one of her best quotes, I don't remember if it was Maria Montessori that said this or if it was a later proponent of Montessori education. But One of the best quotes I heard about it is that play is the work of children.
Okay.
So when all of the rest of the world is saying, you have to study, you have to work hard so that you can get a job, and then you can work some more, and then you can retire. The Montessori education system is saying, let your children play, and they will learn. And let your children play in the way that is natural for children to play. So when my 3-year-old daughter uses her little toy broom and is sweeping, what she is learning is how to clean.
Mm-hmm.
When she's constantly pestering my wife to be helping her with the dishes or helping to clean up or this or that, she is gravitating towards that naturally, and she wants to do it. And to her, it's play.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun. So we're not going to stop her from doing that. That's why you have toys for little ones like alphabet blocks. That is a Montessori learning tool.
Mm-hmm. Let's play and learn the alphabet all at once.
Precisely. You're not tricking your children into learning by disguising learning as play, which is what most modern preschools do. You are letting them play and learn at the same time. You are letting them learn through play.
Mm-hmm.
It all depends on what your starting point is. If your starting point is learning, then you have to disguise it as play. But if your starting point is play, then you can make that play about learning.
Yeah, because even if it's modern learning disguised as play, I mean, it can't reach the level of what you're describing with Montessori. Like,
I've really
why not
never
make
heard
it as
anything
organic and natural as possible, and as easiest to learn as possible, while still actually doing the learning? Like, if you just care about objectives, like, you're still going to get the objectives.
Yeah.
Met.
I have honestly never heard anything bad about Montessori education, and although I don't fully understand it, it seems like a really great thing to me. Because you are letting your children be children. Because a long time ago, we had this thing. Again, something you see in a lot of shows, television shows in the 50s. There was this idea that you have to let your children be children. And that makes sense. But we had a lot of, after the Great Depression and after the two World Wars, we don't really know what a kid is anymore. Particularly after the Great Depression, when basically everybody has to go to work. And again, after the Industrial Revolution, when we're sending children to work in factories.
Yeah, child labor is a very different image.
There's sort of this twisted idea of really what a child is. And when we say that play is the work of children, we mean good play, wholesome play. Play that will actually help the child amount to something, ultimately, to help, to use a modernist, more utilitarian turn of phrase. So kind of in the 1950s and in the 1960s and so on and so forth, you have a lot of parents who grew up during wartime and during Depression time.
Mm-hmm.
So when they're children, as children, in order for their family to survive, they have to go and do adult type of work way too early. Like, you have to go and get an actual job when you're 10 in order for your family to survive. And even in the 50s, it's like this in the poorer parts of cities. You have to go and get an actual job when you're 10, 12, 13, 14.
Yeah, so the image of a child laborer is so radically different from the image of a kid for more or less the rest of human history leading up to that point, or enough of it, that it necessitates, in the minds of many, a different way of schooling them.
It's the child labor in the factory. Basically, it's this, well, we need to make sure that children are able to be children. And you have a lot of fathers that work very, very hard and to ensure that their children can be children so that their children don't have to do the same thing that they did.
Mm-hmm.
Which is commendable on the part of a father. It's like no father wants his son to go out into a not so great part of town and shine shoes for an entire day, multiple days in a row.
Mm-hmm.
No father wants his son to go into a factory and work for some other guy who probably doesn't even care about his son's well-being. So it's a commendable thing for you to not want your son to work. But there kind of ends up being this, oh no, don't work yet. That's for when you're done with school. Don't work yet. That's for when you grow up. And this sort of creates a dividing line between child and adult rather than a transitory period.
Mm.
Now, as a culture, you do have to have a point where you can tell your son that he's a man and you can tell your daughter that she's a woman. You do have to have that at some point. But for a father to be able to tell his son that he's a man, he has to be watching his son go through this process of becoming a man.
And we used to have that with familial trades and guilds and all these other things, and now we, in this setting of the 20s and the Industrial Revolution, we don't have that. So what takes its place?
We certainly don't have it anymore. And what happens when you say, well, I want my son to just be a kid? It not only changes the definition of what a child is, it changes the definition of kind of what play is. So again, when in Montessori they say that play is the work of children, they don't mean play in the same way that even when we were kids, most adults meant play.
Yeah.
They meant, well, there's play and there's work. So you can't go play now because that's frivolous and you got to be work. You got to work. You got to do something good. You got to do something substantial.
Yeah.
Whereas play being the work of children, play is not frivolous. And the frivolity of modern play has to do with the rise of corporatism and entertainment and basically all of the modern shifts toward that. When, you know, the toys that you're getting for your children aren't, not that I'm saying that toys have to be practical. You can buy your son's toy guns, you can buy your daughter's dolls and things like that. You know, when children aren't learning anything as they're playing, they're just constantly either pretending or they're being just frivolous.
Okay.
And it's not that play in and of itself is frivolous, because it's not. Play is the work of children. They learn things by doing that. But play starts to be seen as something frivolous because it is not deliberately work.
So I hear that, and here are some initial thoughts I have. I wonder how true that is, because if I just look at the toys that a normal family might have, beyond the, the alphabet letters and such, like maybe there's a foam worm or something, that the youngest daughter can play with and bat around or whatever, but she's kind of learning about an animal. And maybe the young son has a toy dump truck, and maybe it has the back that you can like lift and you can dump this toy rock that comes with it or something.
Right.
Now, are you learning a ton about the world? Heck no. But you are learning enough for a kid, maybe. Like, you're learning about something that's cool. You're going to see the bigger version of that later in life and be like, hey, maybe I kind of like that. Maybe I don't. You're going to see worms later in life and maybe they're different. But it's not the same as perhaps the type of play that would have been done pre-industrial revolution. And it's not as connected to what you're going to be doing in life as that. Like, it's less connected to the work your father or mother do. Does that make any sense?
Well, I probably should have clarified a few things too. And it's not that, like, we see a lot of the old toys that children had 150 years ago or farther back. And a lot of them seem kind of dumb or frivolous to us. But even as simple as, like, the cup on a stick that has a ball on a string that you do that with. I forget what it's called. You try to get the ball into the cup.
Mm-hmm.
Or even something like paddleball or a hacky sack or any number of things. I remember one of them. One old toy was basically you had kind of a stick, and then you had the band off of a barrel, and you took the stick and you rolled the band off the barrel with it. At that point, you actually are learning a lot of things about motion,
Mm-hmm.
and you were to an extent learning some things about physics. But kids today do that, and not to be. I'm 27, not to make it sound like I'm 45, but the way that kids today are entertained. I think it would have been better if I had said that play becomes frivolous when it becomes about entertaining your child and occupying your child's time. And television is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a huge contributor as well.
Yeah. It's not that you can't learn some stuff, but I don't know. You can always say by their fruits you shall judge them. And by that argument, I have much less of a problem with the, ball connected to the paddle by a string than I do, giving your 8-year-old Clash of Clans and just seeing what that turns him into.
Yeah. Because right now this is the toy in a disproportionate number of households.
This is true.
And when your child's play, it's more and more like this as the child is younger and younger and younger. When your child's play is about having whatever your child plays with is, as brightly colored or makes, as cool of a sound or does as cool of a thing as possible, there's a disconnect there. And if we can sort of move this back onto the original topic, because I think I'm merging into territory where I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about, because my oldest child is 3. I think when you try to take a child and for as long as possible say, well, you're just a child. Well, you're just a child. Well, you're just a child. Okay, now you're an adult. And now here's all this adult responsibility, even though you have been told that you're a child and you need to do child things. Because nowadays, kids are doing child things. Well, they're encouraged to do child things until they're 18.
And now you can vote.
You can't drink yet, but you can serve in the military and you can vote. Or we think we have to give them milestones to where they're getting closer and closer to being an adult. Like, you can drive when you're 16. But remember, you're still not an adult yet. You're still just a child. And modern education is really bad about this. Because I remember part of the reason that I don't teach in a school is the school that I had been teaching at, the 1 year that I did teach, the actual reason that I no longer teach there is because I had an assignment that probably only 4 out of my 18 students actually did, and the other 14 students got zeros. And I was the one that got called into the principal's office as the teacher, and I got told, well, we can't have that. When that many students fail, it's just assumed that it's the teacher's fault, that you didn't teach them right, or that you didn't give them clear instruction.
And yet we all know that if you want to train them to be an adult, if you want to train them to, be good workers, although obviously education is about far more than that, then even at that basic level, you have failed as soon as you bring that attitude into the school.
Oh, I'm not done telling you what this principal told me.
Okay.
I was told that it's the teacher's fault if the student doesn't understand it. And, well, you really should have been constantly reminding them about the project, even though I told all their parents, I had sent all their parents an email about this project that they were supposed to be working on in school and at home.
Mm-hmm.
And I always had it up on the assignment board, which was up in the front of the class, and it was in great big letters where they couldn't have missed it. My students were 5th and 6th grade. I taught a combined class.
I take it none of them were blind, capable of reading.
None of them were blind. They were capable of reading. I had 2 students that had learning disorders. So those 2 I'm willing to give a pass to because they don't think the same way. So I can't teach them in the same way. Those 2, it makes sense. And if they don't understand something, I told them to ask. They could have asked if I needed to explain things more clearly. They just didn't do it. Or they didn't complete it properly.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't complete it the way that I had said to complete it. My students are 5th and 6th grade. The youngest in the class is 10. The oldest is 13. What I was told to my face was this exact verbatim for why I should have been constantly on them and constantly monitoring every single one of my 18 students to make sure they knew exactly what they were supposed to do. Verbatim, I was told, they're still babies. To which in the back of my head, I'm going, do you know what a baby is? So now you're not even a child until the time you're 18. You're a baby until you're in high school. So yes, my first thought was, well, you clearly don't know what a baby is. My second thought was, I don't think you and I approach babies the same way. Because the only thing you need to give a baby constant attention for is food and burping and poop. That's a baby's constant attention because he literally cannot do it himself. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle when he was 10, but my 10-year-old was a baby and is not capable of doing anything of his own. So, and I think a lot of that is where it's very common now for a lot of the older people to complain, mostly about Gen Z, but also to an extent about millennials, of, well, they just refuse to grow up. Yes, but that's also not necessarily their fault, because they haven't actually been properly taught what growing up is, because they haven't been slowly given responsibility. And as my children get older, my daughter has a natural inclination to want to do the same chores her mother does. Setting the table, helping her cook, helping her do the dishes. And my son, at almost 1.5, has the natural inclination just to hurl a ball at my head as hard as he possibly can.
Both
a later
honorable
conversation
for the same
for what?
Both honorable for the same reason. But at least back in the day, like public schools used to have a home ec class. You know?
Yeah. There are some
Now that
schools
would be
that still do.
considered sexist.
I worked with a guy that was actually I think he's 3 years younger than me. 3 or 4 years younger than me. And he had a home ec, or no, it wasn't home ec. He actually had a shop class in his high school.
Mm-hmm.
But he went to a high school that was out in the podunk middle of nowhere in southern Missouri. So a lot of the country schools are actually still doing it right, at least when it comes to that. But I think a lot of them also put more of an education or more of an emphasis on their trade education. Because that's just what most kids from those areas wind up doing. And in like agriculture and things like that.
The practicality to it makes sense, yeah.
And it does make sense. If you see the pattern, you follow along with the pattern. But you also shouldn't discourage the other things you see or the other things that you can be teaching them. That'll be gotten to at another point at some later date. So, you know, when we're told that, oh, Gen Z doesn't want to grow up, or that millennials didn't want to grow up, or that Gen Xers never really did grow up, yeah, they didn't, because everybody kind of forgot what growing up actually is. They think that, you go from a child to being an adult, and then there's this concept of the teenager that comes around in the 20th century and is never mentioned in history before that. Because
the
there is
previous
still,
version
you're
of
either...
teenager was the apprentice, which is
Yes.
kind of the opposite of the modern teenager.
But, so the modern teenager is basically I am physically maturing into an adult, but I am mentally still a child. And those two things are at war, which is why the hormones are raging. Rather than allowing somebody to mentally and physically and spiritually mature at the same time, or kind of at similar rates.
Mm-hmm.
We just forget what growing up actually is. Because we keep telling our kids, no, like, you're still a child, you're still a child, you're still a child. And then when they grow up, they're like, well, being a child was more fun than being an adult. So I don't want to be an adult. I want to be a child still.
Yep.
And because you didn't slowly introduce actual responsibility to them, more and more we're seeing people in our generation go, well, I don't want responsibility. Because it wasn't properly introduced to them when they were younger, all of a sudden it's just being lumped on them now.
Yep.
You suddenly have all the responsibilities, and you suddenly have to just completely grow up.
Which is not how human beings work. So I wonder...
we develop and we grow and we mature at a certain rate. And that rate may be different for different people. Not everybody has to go through it in exactly the same rate, but it should be a steady rate.
Mm-hmm.
Psychological problems get caused usually from trauma or just a sudden shift.
Yep. And like you said, when the body and mind are fighting each other, there are different levels of development, one could say. That in and of itself is anxiety inducing. It is trauma in some sense. Part of the body is stuck. Part of the human person is stuck. And then you wonder why everybody's anxious about, 50,000 things in their life. It's like, well, you can probably trace a fair bit of that to a common root. It's like, how about you heal the core of the problem? I'm also sitting here thinking about all of the people who are our age who are raised in that boat, and all 5 of them that are listening to this podcast, potentially. And potentially sitting there thinking, okay, I recognize that in myself. Like, that's how I was raised. Kid for a long time, not given responsibilities that maybe I wanted, or, not allowed to do things that I wanted to, or if I even wanted to do them. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I was just a lazy schmuck of a kid who wanted to do nothing but play. And then you get chucked in the real world and you're an adult, like you're talking about. But they want to be better than that now. And they want to raise their kids differently in the future, but they see in themselves all of these problems still, and they're just like, I have a lot of ways to grow.
Yeah.
And how do I do that? How do I do that at whatever age you're at? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I have thoughts, but what say you?
Well, I think you basically said it. Is that there's going to be a lot of people in our generation who, were treated just as kind of just the same until their age ends with teen.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're maybe treated a little bit differently. But they're still basically just treated as children with hormones.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than that actually being you're becoming a man or you're becoming a woman. Which no male is ever fully a man until he is a father in some capacity, and no woman is ever fully a woman until she's a mother in some capacity. But that's kind of beside the point. When you see teenagers in the neighborhood going out and doing stuff, they're probably not studying. And they're probably not working nights. They're going out having parties where they're drinking underage. They're not doing anything. They're not doing anything conducive to human flourishing. It's frivolity. And that's what frivolity is. Anything that doesn't help you flourish is either frivolous or worse. And frivolity is ultimately a detriment to your flourishing as a human. So when the concept of play, when adults start to think of play as something frivolous, it's this, well, we can't have our children doing frivolous things. They got to learn to work. So then you start forcing your child to work when all he really wants to do is play. And then on the other side, we kind of go, well, I want to make sure that my child can play for as long as possible because that's what being a child is.
Mm-hmm.
Being a child is just being frivolous and not really caring about anything but yourself and just playing all the time, which is not what being a child is. My own daughter is a testament to that because she is constantly asking me questions. She is constantly inquisitive.
Mm-hmm.
That's why children are constantly asking questions. Yes, it is play, but it is also learning.
Yep.
And neither of those things for a child is frivolous.
No, it's life and death. It's the dump truck is going to come get me.
The competency of your parents is life and death when you're a child, but
yeah.
We wind up having this, people who are raised in the one side that said, well, we can't have our children constantly playing. We have to make them work, so then they can be adults and work some more.
Mm-hmm.
That camp, kids get raised in that camp, and then they grow into adults hating the world because their childhood sucked because their parents never let them play.
Yep.
And then in the other camp, which starts to grow because of these people over here moving over to that camp and raising their children according to that camp.
Mm-hmm.
Because, when you experience one bad thing as a human, your natural tendency is to immediately just go to the opposite thing. Because this was bad, the direct opposite must be good, rather than the virtuous mean being the actual good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they go over to the other side and they say, well, children should just be frivolous all the time. And children shouldn't have any worries and they shouldn't have any concerns. And everything should just be provided for them. And we should be giving them answers before they even ask the question. And all that sort of thing. Because that makes life easy for the child. Well, guess what? You've also made life frivolous for the child.
And the irony is you've made life hard for the child.
Frivolous children become frivolous adults. Overworked children become workaholic adults. It's kind of how it is. So again, the answer, because we're Catholic, is somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
You have to acknowledge that for a child, play and work for at least a certain period of time are the same thing. And even for adults, play and work are kind of the same thing. So rather than education being about, well, you got to go to school so you can go to high school, so you can go to college, so you can get a degree, so you can get a job, so you can make money. Education should be about the flourishing of the human person.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, it should be about making you into a flourishing and virtuous human person rather than about making money or having a job. You need a job. I'm not contesting that.
Mm-hmm. But your job is not just, it's where I put in my 40 hours a week. It's not so I can earn money so I can retire. It is the gift of myself to the world.
And this kind of goes back to why, something that we didn't actually discuss last time, which was why a man should love his work. For a child, play is work. For a man, work is play.
All said.
That actually ultimately is the difference between man and child. For a child, play is work. And for a man, work is play. To put it the way that my grandfather always did, if you do what you love and you love what you do, you'll never have to work a day in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, even in the things that we love, there's aspects of it we hate. I love working with wood. I hate sharpening my tools.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to do that to do the thing that I love. And as much as I hate sharpening my tools, I love working with wood and shaping it and making it into something even more. By the way, the link to my Etsy shop will be in the description.
Yes, it will. But it doesn't even have to be like someone could listen to that and say like, well, fine, but I have no passion in my work. Or are you just saying that, you have to follow your passions? And it's like, no, that's not what we're saying.
No.
Like learn to love it over time. How do you come to know God? Well, you got to start somewhere.
You get to know him over time.
You get to know him over time, and love doesn't start from the beginning. Love isn't there at the beginning, probably. Well, you sure hope it is. But even if it is, like we know the spiritual life goes through ups and downs, but that love just grows and grows and grows over time.
It grows and it changes. That's why we don't. That's why, when a man and a woman love one another, we call it falling in love. Although even falling in love, that's more of a modern thing of where it just sort of like, whoops, I fell, and now I'm in love.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more growing into love with one another. And that can happen quickly, but sometimes it can also take time. Sometimes a boy might pursue a girl, and she, for years, tells him to go pound sand.
And then we have a laugh when they get married.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, they court for 2 weeks, and then they get married, and they have about 17 children. Because they realize they really like each other. That's one way it happens.
Yep.
Or another way could be like how it was with my wife, where she says, I like you. And then a little over a year later, we were married. And 9 months later, we had our first baby, who is now 3.
Mm-hmm.
And we're expecting a third.
Yep. And he's almost here.
He's almost here. So I hope that was related to education. I think it was.
Well, it is. I mean,
because it's about growth and development. Rather than, okay, you go from this stage to this stage, and I'm going to pull you from this stage to this stage.
Mm-hmm. Because we're talking about something that we can talk even more about. Like, what's the purpose? Is it to go into one of these two camps? Is it to pursue some model for the sake of pursuing it? What are you ultimately pursuing in your child's education? You better be pursuing the right things. What are those right things? Virtue, truth, goodness, beauty, the formation of the human person, making them the best person they can be. And what's the best version of who they can become? Someone who pours himself out as a gift every single day. I can use that to counter frivolity in my life, and I can use it to counter, become a workaholic and retire, which is both opposite vices put together in a sense. I'm not saying no one should retire, but there's something lacking about work, retire. It's more fulfilling if it's just, no, let me work. I don't need to worry about putting money away for 40 years down the road when I can be putting that money into my children, or at least a good portion of it. I'm not saying don't save. But let me do the thing in front of me right now to the best of my ability. Like, just let me do that.
Yeah, put your finances and your effort into your children, and not just throw money at them.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're putting growth hormones on a plant to try to make it grow faster. It's put your effort and put your resources into raising good children and into raising good people. The school will teach you how to be a doctor. Your father should teach you how to be a man.
Yes. And on that note, walk me through, in your estimation, although I know we're of the same mind on this, what version of schooling is best, what versions of schooling are the worst, and why?
It doesn't get much worse than what we have now. Again, I think we're in agreement on this.
Yeah.
So, I think what would be best would be sort of a hybrid homeschool system where children are primarily homeschooled, but also have like a co-op.
Mm-hmm.
Or here in my hometown, we have what's called the Lighthouse Preparatory Academy, where they actually it's a literal, true hybrid home and brick and mortar school.
Mm-hmm.
So they have some homeschool days. I think 3 days they're homeschool, and then 2 days out of the week they're actually in physical classrooms. So if we do something, I think the best education system, and I'm just musing on this the way Aquinas would, is one that in practice is that, and follows the following model. If we take the Montessori model for the earliest years of childhood, where it's all very textile and all very grabby hands, learny with your fingies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the way that 3 to 6-year-olds like to learn. If we do that for a certain period of time, then we approach the classical model. So you sort of graduate from the Montessori model into the classical model. And Montessori has taught you in the way that a child learns. The classical model will help you learn in the way that you do as you're becoming a man, as you're becoming an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching the trivium and the quadrivium, which you can't purely teach those anymore because of how many different directions education has exploded into, how many different disciplines there are, but something that is similar to that, something that follows that kind of model. So I would say that we follow the Montessori model from, and by the way, again, this is also pure theory because I don't know what I'm talking about, but I think if we follow the Montessori model up until 4th, probably actually up until about 6th grade, and then we do we take that like 4th, 5th, and 6th grade years, and we use that as sort of a transition period into a classical education. And then they have classical education until the end of high school.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, they go to college, where the college does actually what it should do, which is specialize them. So their education should be as well-rounded as possible by the time they get out of high school. And in doing that, they will kind of, through high school and through their time in classical education, they will kind of have learned and been able to glean sort of where their life is meant to go, what they're supposed to be doing with their lives, what they're supposed to be, what they want to be. And then college helps you do that. And then you're still fairly young when you get out of college. You're 21, 22.
This is true.
And whether or not you do that, or you're in high school and you decide, I want to be somebody's apprentice.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're 16 and you decide, I want to be an apprentice cobbler and learn how to make shoes. Okay, go find a cobbler and ask him how to teach you how to make shoes. Ask to be his apprentice. And your first year, you'll probably hold nails for him. Or he'll probably say, here, hold this piece of leather. You can't hurt that.
Yeah.
Because you're a first-year apprentice. Apprentice does not get paid because you are a student. And you should probably live close by to wherever your master is. But around the high school years is where people should be actually making those decisions of what they want to do with the rest of their lives. And again, it shouldn't be a make your decision at this point. The education should be modeled to help them grow into that and figure that out.
I agree.
As opposed to, well, you've learned 7 subjects. Which one do you want to pursue for the rest of your life?
Present that a different way to people, basically. Like, sure, you'll have learned a bunch of stuff by this point, but yeah.
And again, by the time you're 18, which is of age in the United States, it could be younger. 16 would potentially work. But by the time you're of age, you should be able to be self-sufficient in whatever it is that you're taught.
And to anybody who says that we can't be that way, we were that way once.
It worked for the majority of human history up until about 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Mark Twain was an apprentice typesetter at 14.
Mm-hmm.
And he was good at it.
For my own answer to the question, I'm gonna cheat. I'm just gonna take what you said basically, and then make some slight twists to it. Maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. Who knows? But I think that the hybrid homeschooling model is best, and it needs to be done in a co-op. It should be done in a co-op setting, or if not a co-op setting, then just in a communal setting. The communal setting is ultimately what matters.
If I can build on that a little bit.
Go for it.
The hybrid setting with a transitory aspect. So in the earliest years, so starting in preschool, you are entirely at home.
Mm-hmm.
And by your last year of high school, you're entirely in a classroom. Because if we're going to give them classical education, not that they can't learn that, but students do need to learn how to be around peers and how to be around equals.
Mm-hmm.
Which nobody is actually equal in a home. Unless you're a twin.
Yeah. So
even after, it's not just mom and dad are here and the kids are here. You have father as head, mother as heart.
Mm-hmm.
They have equally important but distinct roles. And then there will always be a hierarchy among the children. The parents aren't going to, if mom and dad have to go out for a night, if mom and dad go on a date, they don't say, hey, kids, elect which one of you is in charge.
Nope.
No, we just say, the oldest is in charge. You're 15, you know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
If their only exposure to others is in the context of somebody being greater or lesser than them, hierarchically speaking, then they won't really know how to operate in a world where the guy next to you actually just is your equal. You do learn respect for elders that way. And you should be competent in speaking with people of many different age groups. But you also do need to just be able to be around people who are your own age.
Mm-hmm.
And within a year, either way. Or 2.
So to continue my thought experiment in light of that, the co-op is there, but it's not necessarily like, it's not all, okay, this is just a group of families and some of us teach classes to everybody else. That's good. That's awesome. Do that. But it's not just that. It's a system where everybody is on the same page as us in terms of what they want their kids' education to be. Both the dad and the mom are involved, not just for their own kids, but for all the kids of the community, because trades are getting taught. Play dates are happening. You're learning from your father, but you're also learning from the guy next door who's doing the cool thing that, like, if he's panning a house and you're interested in helping him, well, go help him. Let him teach you.
Yeah.
if you know the guy in the next neighborhood is really good at hunting and you want to hunt, go hunting with him. Learn. Just learn by
I would
doing.
argue that it's every father's prerogative to teach his son how to hunt, but
Well, I guess I'll have to learn how to do that for my kids then. But I want learning to be a very communal thing the entire way through. And some of that is going to happen in a Montessori framework, although I think you could both run it through 4th and 6th grade and run it so that 6th grade ends maybe when 4th grade would normally end. And just in terms of ages. If you marry that with the idea of grades don't have to be intrinsically linked with each other. So if somebody's an expert at something, let them learn to be an expert at the thing. And maybe it's fine if they're an expert writer, but they hate math. Maybe it's fine if they effectively do Comp 2 at 14, but do Algebra 1 at 16.
yes.
Like, at the end of the day, who the hell cares? There's a certain amount that's like baseline that you should know for multiple reasons, including the annoying legal one. But you can bring more of a sense of realism to what you learn.
Yeah. It is okay to be at a sophomore in high school level in English, but still be at an 8th grade level in math.
Yep.
Because you don't have to learn every single thing at exactly the same rate, because you are not the person next to you. You may be at a sophomore level in English and an 8th grade level in math, but he may be at a sophomore level in math and an 8th grade level in English.
Yep.
And then guess what? You can help each other.
Exactly.
And you can learn from each other.
Those are my very raw, unrefined thoughts. I don't know. Help me fine-tune them. My job isn't to be right. My job is to think.
That should be our byline for the podcast now.
My job isn't to be right. My
job is not to be right. It's just to think.
That makes you more dangerous.
That just describes what a professional philosopher is.
Yay.
I don't have to be right. I just have to think. But I'm more successful if I make everybody else think that I'm right.
Yep. Just be smarter than Nietzsche and Freud. No, be wiser than Nietzsche and Freud, and you'll be fine.
And Marx.
Yeah.
We'll throw Marx in there too.
Yes, we must.
But yeah, so I'm thinking, so just to fully lay it out, and I think we'll probably close on this because of how late it's getting. To fully lay it out, I think, so we start sort of with that Montessori model, and you just let the children learn. Let your children, who turn into your students, let them learn whatever it is that they learn at whatever pace that they can learn. And slowly transition them. So after that, then you start introducing things like the trivium and the quadrivium, where they can be learning logic, they can be learning rhetoric, because everybody needs to learn how to speak. Nobody knows how to do that anymore. We need to actually learn how to speak and speak properly and speak from the chest, because I guarantee you everybody's voice would be more pleasant if they spoke from the chest instead of through their nose like everybody does. So let them learn logic, let them learn rhetoric.
Your selling point for that is just, how do you want to sound to the woman you're pursuing?
Yeah, that's great for men. That's good for young men.
Yes.
But so start with Montessori, and then transition into a classical model that takes you through high school, and let it start at home, and then transition into a brick and mortar school. Because you need to learn, one, in a brick and mortar school, you're dealing with your teachers who are authority figures over you who are not your parents. And you're also frequently dealing with your exact peers, because they're in the same level of whatever class that you're in. as you are.
I especially like that point of adding the brick and mortar element to it. Like,
And then take the university to further specialize.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then, but ultimately, with the knowledge that your education and your learning should never cease. Everyone can always learn something more. So you should always be studying, you should always be reading, and you should always be learning something. You should have both work and hobbies, and guess what? You should enjoy all of them. As I already said, for a child, play is work. For a man, work is play. And I think we can end on that.
Thank you all for joining us, and God bless you all. Have an excellent evening.